This is the audio-only version of the podcast. To watch the video and get more details and show notes, go to paancestors.com. Welcome back to Your Pennsylvania Ancestors, and I am thrilled to have the Presbyterian Historical Society join me for the podcast. This is my first religious archive that I've interviewed, and I hope to do more of these because a lot of us researching in Pennsylvania, particularly early Pennsylvania, are not able to figure out or use or access the religious records of our ancestors. We commonly call these church records in genealogy. I'm calling it religious records just to broaden the term beyond just Protestant and Catholic churches. And these archives have wonderful original records. So these are like the handwritten real deal, which we love as genealogists because you never know the comments and little ephemera, little miscellaneous that you can get around these records. So I have Sonia Prescott and Jenny Barr with me, two experts, archivists, public relations folks from the Presbyterian Historical Society. If you're watching this on YouTube, you're going to want to make sure to watch all the way to the end because they're going to walk you through how to access the catalog on a PowerPoint presentation that they do. And if you're listening to the audio, you might want to hop over to the YouTube channel, PA Ancestors, and just catch that. Luckily, it's on video, so you can stop and pause and back up and teach yourself how to work through those catalogs. As you know, as a genealogist, every catalog online is a little bit different. They all have their little quirks of how they operate. So take the time to figure it out and make the most of it so you make sure you're accessing records on your ancestors. So here's the Presbyterian Historical Society based in Philadelphia, but they have records from all over the country. So share this with all your genealogy friends who might have Presbyterian ancestors. I am so thrilled to welcome to the podcast my first religious archives, and I hope to be one of many more, because if you don't know the religion of your ancestors, you really are missing a whole huge part of their life, especially in early Pennsylvania. So I have with me today Sonia Prescott, who is the public services person for the Presbyterian Historical Society. You will probably see her name more often than not. Now you have her face to go with it. And also Jenny Barr, who's a reference archivist for the Presbyterian Historical Society. Welcome to the podcast. And we're going to kick off with, what does the Presbyterian Historical Society have? A really broad question. And I know that you're based in Philadelphia, and it's a wonderful old building. If you ever get to visit, people will be thrilled to be there. But what is it that your association or society has for genealogists?
We are the National Archives of the biggest Presbyterian denomination, the Presbyterian Church in the USA. And what we have is a little bit of everything. We've got a lot of everything, as it turns out. We have records, individual congregations, and that is probably the most important thing for people doing genealogy and family history research. We also have records of the denomination itself, the national agencies of the church, for example, the Board of Foreign Missions. We have records of individual ministers and missionaries, personal papers of people who have worked for the church. And we have records of ecumenical organizations like the National Council of Churches and Church World Service. Those are examples. So we've got, I think, upwards of 30,000 cubic feet of archival records. And I don't know the number of individual churches for whom we hold congregational records. Someone asked me that question, and we should figure out the answer to that because it is a lot. We have records for churches in Pennsylvania and the Mid-Atlantic states, but also every other state in the US and some US territories, Puerto Rico being a great example of that. So the church records that we have are, we've got registers, church registers, which would be really sort of the go-to record for genealogy. And we have session minutes, which document the sort of weekly and monthly business of the church. So they give you a sense of the history of what's happening in that church over time. So that's sort of the high level overview of the records that we have.
Okay. And when a genealogist contacts you, are they the historical society, are they reaching you, Sonia? Are you the first point of contact?
Sometimes, because I work in the public services department with a few other folks. It could be me, it depends on if it's via email or over the phone, or sometimes when we are open to the public, sometimes folks just come in and it's whoever is working at the reference desk that day.
Okay. And so what's the most common question people what are they mostly asking for when they're approaching you?
I would say the most common question is, do you have records from, either they'll say from a particular congregation if they know the congregation, but more often than not, folks will just say, do you have records of my great grandfather? And they kind of leave it at that, which leads us to, the next couple of questions that we have to ask to help answer that question.
And what are those? Because your records aren't like going to Ancestry. You don't have things indexed to the point where you can just type on the computer and say, oh, show me where the record is for, Joe Smith or something. Yeah. So you need to know where the person lived, I'm guessing.
Yeah, the most important thing for us to even begin to answer that question is always the name of the congregation and the city and state that the congregation was located in. That's how our records are organized. And so once we have that, then we can figure out, okay, do we have records of this particular congregation? And then we can figure out, okay, and what records do we have from that congregation? And all of those have to be answered before we can say definitively yes or no, we have a baptism record for, say, John Smith. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That is one of those that depends questions, of which there are many for people doing genealogy. We have worked with both Ancestry and years ago with Family Search to digitize and now index many of the congregational records we have here. So while we, if people are contacting us, we say, what's the name of the church and where is it and what time period are you looking at? But over the past 5 or 8 years, we did work with a team from Ancestry, and they came in and they scanned and indexed many of the congregational records we have here. So while we don't have a centralized database of names, it is a good starting place for people doing family history research to check Ancestry to see if some of those records that we scanned, if they can find their ancestor's name in those records.
Okay.
So it's, because we didn't scan everything that we have in the building, you can't say that if you don't find it on Ancestry, it's not there. It's definitely worth checking with us anyway. Do check in Ancestry because maybe it'll be there.
Okay, so, and you're always getting, I want to say new records, but they're really old records. So like things do come quite frequently, right, to your building?
Yeah,
Okay.
We've got a pretty active accessioning program for churches to deposit their records with us. It's voluntary for churches to deposit the records. So, maybe if a church is still active, they may still have their old records, or they may decide to send them to us for safekeeping because we've got good environmental controls and, we keep them safe here in the building. And you're right, those can be old records, those can be recent records. Churches tend to want to keep their most recent records just for day-to-day business purposes. But once they get pretty old, and they want to clean out their closets or their basements or whatever, then they pack them up and ship them off to us. So you're right, we are constantly getting new new batches of records, and those won't have been scanned, obviously, in Ancestry.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we did talk a little bit before we started this podcast about the presentation that you have on how to research your online catalog to get to know what you actually have there on site. And we'll put that in at the end of this interview. So people should stay tuned or keep listening or fast forward or whatever you need to do to get to the presentation part if you're interested in how to research the catalog. But I did want to talk about, so because we had talked about this too before the podcast, before we hit record, is, is a little bit about the life of particularly early rural Presbyterians, people that were kind of spread out across Pennsylvania, because there's the way people lived in Philadelphia, and then there's kind of the way people lived outside of Philadelphia, outside of the sort of the biggest city. And I think that's where a lot of the frustration lies for people, is someone out in the middle of quote unquote nowhere, and it's like, well, how do I figure out like what their church was? Did a minister actually come along and do baptisms? Was there, so can you help a little bit with that? Like what was going on?
Yeah, there's going to be a fair amount of variation in the records, both that were kept by those ministers and by those small rural churches. And there's going to be variation in how many of those records actually made their way to us. Our catalogs, we've got an index of congregations, which is a really good starting place for a lot of this kind of research. It's called Hall's Index of American Presbyterian Congregations.
Okay.
And that was put together by some really dedicated volunteers who sat and typed up church names and dates from printed minutes of the General Assembly, which is the nationwide yearly meeting of Presbyterian delegates from Presbyterian churches across the country. And in each volume of the minutes, there's a role of the presbytery. So each presbytery reports in the congregations that are within its bounds. And there's some basic statistical information, who the minister is, how big the congregation is, what the membership of Sunday school classes is, and then their financial contributions to various programs in the church. So that list of churches was then compiled into this index of congregations. It's searchable by church name, by location, but the location is city or state. Unfortunately, we don't have a way to search by county. So for people who are trying to identify the name of a church where their ancestors might have attended or been members, it can involve a little bit of legwork. You have one tab open with the index and one tab open with a map. So I'm going to search all the different major town names near the city that I'm looking at. Another little issue that comes up with that index is that over time, the location names of some of the churches might have shifted a little bit. The post office name, maybe sometimes the church is in one town, and then a couple of years later, the boundaries of the town change a little bit and it's in a different town. That can be really frustrating and difficult to wade through all those details. So finding the name of the church, as Sonia said at the beginning, is kind of a key part of this. For the small rural churches, it's, if we have the records here, they will be listed in our one of two major catalogs that we have. And that, if you look at the slide presentation that we're going to be linking to this podcast, you'll see some instructions on how to search those different catalogs. There are some other ways to get to that information. We don't have as many of these records, but we do have some pastoral registers. So if you happen to know the name of a pastor who would have officiated at a baptism or a marriage, for example, you can search for the pastor's name, and sometimes you'll find that we have registers of the work that that pastor did in churches. Compared to the denominations like the Methodist Church, but it's my understanding that there weren't as many sort of circuit riding ministers, especially not once you get into the 19th century, like the mid 19th century. There are fewer pastors that were working, sort of spending their whole time on horseback, going from place to place to place. This is the information that I have about this is based on the circumstantial evidence of what records we have in the collection. So, I can't say for sure what proportion of sort of small rural churches were served by pastors moving from place to place. The records that we have here, the pastoral registers that we have here, tend to be, the pastor's service at church A ends in 1829, and then from 1830 to 1840, he's at church B. So they're sequential and not concurrent. There are a few concurrent ones, but just fewer than I had expected when I started searching the catalog after you asked me the question about circuit riding ministers. So as I said, don't completely quote me on that because I could be wrong. I'm just basing it off of the records that we have here.
Well, I asked you that question based on a Methodist minister's journal that I read, where he was arguing with a Calvinist, he called it, which was a Presbyterian, because Presbyterians followed John Calvin, about the fate of man's soul while he was riding along doing his ministry. So he's arguing with a Presbyterian that he found along the way. And I just thought that was really amusing. People, the mental picture of two men riding on horseback arguing about men's souls, the fate of men's souls in 1780, through the Pennsylvania countryside was a mental picture. But
this is before the internet, when they had other things to think about.
Yeah, so we know the Irish are Presbyterians. This is the group that we associate the most with the Presbyterian faith. But I have to ask, were early African Americans in the Pennsylvania colony, in the early state of Pennsylvania, were they Presbyterians? Am I going to find African Americans in Presbyterian records?
Yeah, so what I found that I think is interesting is that there were a few historic African American Presbyterian congregations that were in existence before the Civil War. Let me see. We have a list of 4. First African Presbyterian Church, which was founded in 1807, Second African, 1824, Lombard Street Central, which was founded in 1843, and Capitol Street Presbyterian Church, which was founded in 1858. These are the churches that we have listed as the oldest African American Presbyterian churches in Pennsylvania. But I would say that I've also found records of African American Presbyterians in with other Presbyterian churches. So there were members who were listed in the registers who were African American in other congregations. So I would say to anybody who's looking for information about an ancestor who was African American, don't focus on just the African American churches, but look for any Presbyterian congregations in the area at that time, and they may have actually been members of that church.
Awesome. Okay. So good to know, because, the past is a foreign country. We don't know how they did things there until we really, really look and start to ask and keep our minds open about what we find. And those historical African American churches that you named, are those on your website? They sound like they're all in Philadelphia. Are they?
So the first 3 are in Philadelphia. The last one that I mentioned, Capitol Street Presbyterian Church, was in Harrisburg.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Yeah. Yep. And they are, I don't think they're actually listed on our website, but they are listed in the presentation, the PowerPoint that we're going to share.
Okay. Good,
Yeah.
good. Because sometimes when people are just focused in one, ethnicity or racial group, it's like they want to just go right to that record set, because somebody might have traveled a good distance in order to go to that church, for like a wedding, a marriage, that kind of thing, or baptism.
The Presbyterian worship setup is a little bit, well, it's completely different than like the Catholic Church with parishes. Presbyterians did not have to go to the closest church. They went to the church that they wanted to go to. Often, especially in rural areas, that would end up being the closest church. And sometimes that meant that people who weren't Presbyterians were attending a Presbyterian church, or, vice versa. And that's just a matter of feasibility. Like, you can't really spend all day, you can't spend 12 hours to get to church. You go to whatever's close. But in urban areas where there are lots of different churches, you can go to whatever church you prefer to. It's a little easier to pick and choose.
And more challenging for the genealogists researching in a
Yes.
in a city.
Yeah, you find your ancestor in the directory and you think, oh, there's a church right next door. That's going to be the one. Not necessarily.
Right.
Yeah.
And if they have a common name, you think, and you're trying to figure out which one's mine. Oh, it must be the one that lives closest to this church. And it's like, well, they might have taken the trolley or just walked across.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas the Catholics, like, no, you were like, you can actually figure out, like, map wise where they went. They couldn't cross the line to get to a different. So before we wrap up this interview, I had a question in my brain, and then I immediately forgot it. So what other nationalities or ethnic groups were Presbyterian?
There are, of course, the Scots-Irish, the Scottish, the Scots-Irish would probably be the biggest single group based on national origin. But there are church records from German, English, Welsh, Italian, Hungarian. Later, you get Asian churches, Korean, Chinese, Japanese, Armenian. A lot of those are more plentiful along the West Coast than they are in Pennsylvania. And then you get into the mission field where Presbyterians were doing mission work both in city centers and in the Southwest with Native Americans. So you have churches that are sort of primarily focused around those national and ethnic groupings. Sometimes those records are in another language, which for us as archivists can be a little challenging. Somebody says, you sent me some information from this register and I don't know what the words at the top of each column mean. So sometimes we have somebody here on staff who can figure out a little bit of German. So, and also Hispanic churches, I feel like I'm probably missing some big groups there. So those national groupings show up in the church records that we have here.
Oh, I was just going to add in that you can search by those different ethnic groupings to a certain extent on halls. So it is possible to type in Spanish or Italian into our halls index, and that can help you narrow it down. It's not comprehensive, and it doesn't necessarily cover every church that may identify that way, but that might be a useful way for folks who are trying to find a particular church.
Oh, that sounds great. So what if people are listening to this and thinking, I have some Presbyterians that I did not find on Ancestry or on Family Search, and I think I need to contact the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. What should be their first step? Where should they go first?
I always advocate going to our website because we have so much information there. It's a great starting place, and it can answer a few of your questions before you even talk to an archivist directly. So I would suggest going to our website, which is history.pcusa.org. But you can always call us directly. Our number is listed on the website as well, or you can send an email. And the most important information, like I said, is just to have a sense of the city and state and the name of the congregation that you're interested in. That's always going to be our starting place for finding records.
Okay.
Yeah, and I want to second what Sonia said about going to the website, because we encourage people to search the catalogs to see if they can identify some of the church records that they might want to see. But there are also a lot of resources on the web that help you contextualize the history of your family. There's lots of information about the history of the Presbyterian Church. One important thing that may come into play when you're doing this research is the different denominations within the Presbyterian, the larger Presbyterian family, or the Reformed churches. And it can be a complicating factor if you're doing genealogy to know whether your ancestor belonged to a new school church or an old school church, or an associate Reformed church or a Presbyterian church. So there will be often, even in fairly small towns, there will be more than one Presbyterian church, and there will be different denominations. So that can help to untangle that complicated story. So there's information on the website about all the different denominational mergers and schisms and different versions of Presbyterianism. So we are always happy to help answer those questions, but if you want to just do some reading to get some of that context as you're starting to do your research about church records, that's there on the website for you.
Oh, that's good, because the churches do have changes to the orthodoxy, sort of, what, and of course the names change. So, always an adventure with genealogy.
Yeah.
People are like, I just wanted to find out when my ancestor was born, and I'm like, no, you got to learn the whole thing. You got to learn the history of the town. You got to learn the whole history of the church. You're not going to get it that easy. It's not going to be easy.
Yeah. We have the same, when we're answering reference questions, we have that same wish. I wish that the church just opened and stayed in the same place and never changed its name and never split and never merged. It would be so much easier, but the church histories are always interesting and almost always quite complicated.
So any final words of advice for genealogists listening and researching Presbyterianism? Or I should say Presbyterians.
I was just going to mention about the genealogy research service. It's described, there's a slide about it on our PowerPoint, but essentially the way the service works is it's a paid service where a genealogist can reach out to us directly and ask if we can search for an individual's record, a particular baptism record or marriage or something like that. But we do specify that we can only search one name and one congregation, and that the fee that you pays for the time and does not guarantee results. So that's just, some of the important tidbits about that particular service. So you're paying, when you pay that fee, you're paying for the time that we put into searching the records. We not necessarily guaranteeing that we will find the record that you're interested in. But, yeah.
Oh, how much is it for the guarantee? I'm teasing. I know. I wish there was a guarantee. It's heartbreaking sometimes.
Yeah.
Jenny, did you have something to add?
I was just going to say, sort of following up with what Sonia said about sort of there not being a guarantee that once you pay for the genealogy research service, we'll be able to provide you with something. But a lot of the genealogists who come in and check the records and don't find anything say, well, at least I can check that off my list. Like it's, I've followed that avenue as far as I can go. And now I know that that's not what I need. So now I can move on to the next thing. So if people have reference questions for us, they're always very welcome to send questions to refdesk@history.pcusa.org. And that's REF as in Frank, DESK.
All right. So that sounds like great advice. for genealogists. And I really hope people do contact you once they've exhausted sort of what they found online and want to dive deeper into their past and the past of Presbyterians in Pennsylvania and in other parts of the country too. This isn't just, you're based in Pennsylvania, you're based in Philly. So I it's like, I have a bias. I think all you do is Pennsylvania, but I really hope that they do contact you because it's a wealth of information and a connection that they won't be able to get any other way. So thank you both for being on the podcast and sharing information and being so open and friendly. It's not like going to church for the first time after a long way away.
Right. And we're reference archivists, and so we really do want people to ask us questions because that's our job. So we do encourage people to, of course, we want people to get to know our resources and our catalogs, but we really do encourage people to reach out and ask questions if they have them. So.
And can I make one last shameless plug? I help manage.
I love shameless plugs. Yeah.
I help manage our social media presence. So anybody who's interested in learning more about our records can always follow us on social media at Presby History on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we also have a YouTube page.
Oh, excellent. So I'll include links to all that in the show notes too, so people can follow along. You have a great social media presence. I feel embarrassed for not bringing it up. It really is educational and beautiful too. So thank you again both for being on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.